Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Michael, Mo, Tim, and the occasional guest discussing analytics issues of the day, and periodically using explicit language while doing so. Find them on the web at analyticshour.io and on Twitter at analyticshour. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 159. You know, in real estate, the old phrase is location, location, location. And maybe when you're writing books about current events, it's like comedy where timing is what matters most. But whatever the case, we're here today to go one level deeper on a topic actually most of us touch almost every day in our jobs as analysts. It's the digital advertising space. Hey, Tim Wilson, you've made the book, The Subprime Attention Crisis, a last call on the show and subsequently mentioned it in multiple episodes since it came out this past fall. Are you super stoked to be so plugged into the zeitgeist here at the dawn of what is hopefully a post-COVID-19 world?
I feel like I've been living with this topic for years and had not seen somebody put it together with so much evidence. So I am, it is like the last part of Christmas for me. It's the last gift.
There you go. The season of giving can now officially end with this episode. And Mo, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm just trying to plot how I'm going to get a word in with Tim today.
Literally, my next question is like, are you going to ready to join me and try to get a word in edgewise on an episode I'm sure will be awesome? And I'm Michael Helbling. But if we're going to discuss the book, The Subprime Attention Crisis, we needed a guest, someone who could lend us their insight into it. So we got the book's author. Tim Hwang is a writer and researcher. He's the former director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance of AI Initiative and previously served as the global public policy lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at Google. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, The Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal, amongst other publications. He lives in New York City, and today he is our guest. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, your timing is excellent. We're delighted to get the chance to chat with you. And by delighted to chat, I mean Tim Wilson has a series of questions he would like to come right into. No,
I am ready to answer them. So how can I help?
No, it's really exciting. We've all had a chance to read your book, and I think all of us found it pretty thought-provoking and fascinating. I think as a great starting point, you know, you spend a couple of the first two chapters of the book kind of laying out the landscape of the digital advertising world. Sure. And I think that's probably a good, you know, at a very high level, let's have a conversation starting maybe there. Most of our listeners will have some familiarity, but good for them to kind of understand, like, yeah, what are you really kind of like, what is the case you're making with this book?
The thesis, if you will.
Oh,
sure.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Hey. Very literary, Mo.
The best place to start with that, I think, is just like how the book came to be. And I'm really glad that is, in fact, the first question, because I think
Nice.
the point of the book, in many ways, you know, whether or not you buy the argument, is just to, you know, explain in simple terms, right? What is this money machine that's at the center of the internet? And, you know, the inspiration for the book really actually came from the time that I was working at Google. And what's surprising is for a company where, you know, 80% plus of its revenue comes from ads, basically the business model of the company is kind of a rumor. You talk to people on a daily basis, they're excited about AI, they're excited about self-driving cars, but even engineers at Google, you say, how do we make money and could you explain the system? And a lot of them frankly don't know, right? And so the point of the book, at the very first sort of part of it is really to explain how online advertising functions on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, there's a lot of complexity, but the basics are pretty simple, right? And some of it is that ads are same as it ever was, right? You have people who have attention that they want to sell. These are people who are known usually as publishers. So this could be everything from, you know, your local newspaper that has a website to Facebook or Google, right? And then on the other hand, you have people who want to buy that attention. They want to spend money to get their message in front of people. And those are the ad buyers. And so far, that's basically the structure, right? The supply and demand of the ad economy that really has defined, you know, how ads have always worked. What's different with the kind of advertising that you have online, though, is that's a form of advertising that's known as programmatic advertising. And essentially what it is that you have basically the buying and selling of attention coordinated through algorithms, and specifically these algorithms that compete in these auctions on a split second basis. So typically the way it works is that you load a website, and immediately at the point at which you load the website, there's a signal that goes out to this marketplace and says, I have a male 25 to 35 living in New York. Does anyone want to buy an ad to deliver to him? And at that split second, there's basically an auction that occurs. And depending on who wins, they basically earn the right to load that ad. And all that happens basically between the time at which I click on a link to when the website loads. And this happens basically billions and billions of times a day. And this really is sort of the rocket fuel. This is the engine, right? That is really creating, Willy Wonka amounts of money to companies like Google and Facebook.
And that's the bit that I like, the way that you explained it actually in the book. I had several very conflicting emotional thoughts reading this. But the one in particular, when you describe that, is like, oh, you're scrolling through things and you've seen an ad and a transaction has happened. I mean, obviously, like, we work in the data space, so I guess we know that a transaction's happened. But I've never actually thought about it as like, oh, I just took part in a transaction that's happened online that I had no input or like oversight of. It left me feeling very strange. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, and I think it is like, I mean, what's amazing about it is like, as from a pure like engineering feat standpoint, it's crazy what we're talking about, right? Like, we've created this massive global infrastructure that does this billions and billions of times a day. And it's so funny because, like, I think on a day-to-day basis, we're sort of not aware of these transactions that are always happening, right? And I do think that, there's almost a feeling of kind of peering behind the curtain a little bit, which I think is a little bit uncanny. It's a little bit, unsettling.
But I think one of the things you quickly get into, and this is where, coming from a digital analytics background, and for the first, 5 to 8 years of that, never really working closely with media agencies. And this was kind of pre-programmatic, when there was still a lot more transparency, but it was felt to be kind of a blunt instrument. I may be buying ads on a specific property or a set of properties, or even if I'm buying audiences, it wasn't full on programmatic, but it does seem like there was this idea, this race to get more efficient is a really good story. We can build the machines. We can get the response time to be quick enough. We can now get everything kind of in the magic, really fast black box that's using machine learning and AI. Mm-hmm. But we're can you maybe talk about how that was a really good story, but then ironically, it actually introduces way less visibility. If you say, I bought 1 million impressions, but I have no idea where they are shown. All I know is the type of person that I was expecting to have them put in front of, and I have to kind of take this big leap of faith that they were put in front of the audience I wanted to put them in front of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the core origin, right, of programmatic advertising, right, like this crazy algorithmic Rube Goldberg machine that we've created, it's really driven by scale, right? And it's in some ways no surprise, right, that Google was one of the first companies to really implement these systems, because suddenly when you're serving up search results and you want to serve ads against them, you really can't have a salesperson that takes a call and says, oh, you'd like to deliver an ad on this time and this date? Sure, we'll put that up on the website. And I think in some ways that is really one of the key dimensions that has also simultaneously produced a lot of opacity in the market, right? Which is when you deliver ads online, you will sometimes deliver hundreds of ads, right, to huge amounts of people. And suddenly it becomes very difficult to track where your ad goes, and in fact, why your ad ends up in a certain place. And I think that is one of the features of the marketplace is, ironically, even though we have a lot more data about when the ad is delivered and how much money you spent on it and that sort of thing, it's also introduced a lot of new opacity in the sense that this plumbing has ads end up in all sorts of places where we don't always understand why it happened the way it did.
I'm just thinking a lot about budgets at the moment, and
Sure.
Suffice to say, there has been lots of shift from some of our more traditional advertising platforms like TV and radio, where you do still call up a person and you book a time and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And without getting into whether either marketing channel is effective or works, because that's a whole nother
Sure.
discussion, companies largely have shifted a huge portion of their budget to that programmatic advertising. Do you think that's fundamentally because of the ease of it, or do you think it's also very deeply coupled with we think it works, so we have access to more data? Like, what really drove that shift?
Yeah, so there's a fascinating anecdote this reminds me of in the early history of Google, where basically Google for a period of time has a team of salespeople who do it the old school way, based in New York. And they're constantly paranoid that basically like Mountain View is attempting to automate them with all this programmatic advertising stuff. And I do think that one way of thinking about the relationship of these companies, right, the new sort of digital giants with sort of the media channels that have existed in the past, really is a competition between sort of like this data-driven, automated way of delivering ads and then sort of like manual seat of your pants way of doing so. And I think in some ways, Mo, to your point, right, like I do think that like the perceived credibility, the perceived power of delivering messages in this way is one of the reasons that the dollars have flowed from one place to the next, right? And I think what the question my book asks is like, is this kind of intuitive fairy tale we tell ourselves, right? Which is like, I have more data, so I should be able to target my messaging better. Is that really the case, right? And is the programmatic advertising system really kind of delivering on its promise, right? And what does it mean that if it doesn't deliver on its promise?
And is there a lineage? It's interesting that if you go to paid search, when you're getting a super powerful signal and that somebody is typing, they type thong into their search bar and
oh wait, are we talking about Australian thongs?
This example actually, Mo, was leading up to a localized exactly where I was heading. So you saw where I was going. But if I type that in, and if I'm a company that sells thongs generically of some sort, then I'm buying on that because I know right now this person has expressed that they have an interest in it. And then it does become well, wait a minute. Where are you? Are you looking for footwear? Or are you looking for, underwear? Okay. Well, Google also generally has a pretty deterministic sense of where you are. So now I can geo-target it. And so that seemed like a very, very good. And even just what's happened with AdWords, with all the bidding and all the thought that went into figuring out relevance and the way that machine has kind of grown, it does seem like there's this idea that when you're saying, oh, I want to target 18 to 24-year-old females who have children and are making decisions about healthcare, that there's this idea that, oh, well, we have the same level of specificity about targeting that person in many different places on the internet that we have of somebody who said thong and I'm interested in thong. Like, is that again sort of part of that myth that we treat all signals? We want to think that anytime there's a field available that we have very specific knowledge, which we kind of did with what are they looking for on the web. Now you don't know if they want to buy a thong or clean a thong or whatever, but still that was much more a stronger piece of information than these kind of attitudinal things.
Yeah, I think there's two subtleties here, right? I think one of the subtleties, which is important, and I think the book sometimes gets misinterpreted in some of the interviews that I've done, which is people say, oh, well, you think that ads just don't work then, right? And I think that isn't the claim, right? Like we definitely have cases in which it seems pretty certain that the ads work. Right. The famous case in search ads is like mesothelioma, right? Like if you're searching for an obscure medical condition, it's because you probably have it, right? And that ends up being like a really powerful signal to deliver an ad, right? The question that the book is asking in some ways is like, is that case that we can think of, is that the norm or is that the outlier, right? And I tend to think that it is the outlier just because even in search, right, which has this reputation of being like the strongest signals, right? There's so many things you can search for that provide totally ambiguous things you might deliver ads against, right? And so I do think that like we have been lulled into a series of kind of, received wisdom about what works and what doesn't online that may actually not really be the case once you start looking into it. Again, I think, Tim, one of the subtleties there too, that I'm sure we're going to get to in this interview is going to be, is the data that you even have on that person accurate? Right.
Yeah.
And so like, we can get to the question of like, does an ad work if you're actually targeting it to the person that you intend and the whole system's working as intended? But there's so many lines of intermediation, places where it can fail. And one of them is just like, how much do we know that we're actually targeting the right person that we think that we are?
So yeah, something that really kind of stood out to me as I read the book was that historically the publisher was the person who provided the information about the person who was being advertised to. And in this ecosystem, we've really changed the ownership of that data. Now the platforms and networks own all that information, and they're the ones controlling who gets what targeting. So Google knows everything about you. Facebook knows everything about you. And so whatever advertisement you get on time.com isn't really being driven by Time as a publisher as much as the network that they're choosing to participate in, and that's doing that. And I just thought that was kind of very interesting, because when you talk about data and personal data, which is sort of an EU concept under GDPR, that has implications potentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do think that, like, again, I think this is one of the reasons it's really useful to think about ads as almost like a lens for thinking about everything that happens on the internet, right? Like, you can almost look at anything that happens on the internet and be like, how did advertising like inform the way this turned out? And I do think that, like, Michael, you're pointing to a really good point, right? Which is basically that, like, even though sort of like the surface of it doesn't seem to have changed all that much, right? Like, the underlying question about like who's holding onto the data and who owns the data has like radically shifted, right? And so like in some ways, like what's immediately obvious may not actually reflect like the deeper reality of the situation.
And that's the funny thing, is that now these marketing platforms are also asking us for more data. Like, when you send them a particular list that you want to target, they're like, oh, you can enrich it with this, this, and this, and that will help us with better targeting, which will make your ROI more efficient. And like, they try and incentivize you to share even more data about your user base, which ultimately the word guardian comes to mind, but it feels really inappropriate in this case. And that, I mean, that just makes their engine better and bigger, which, there was no question there, just disappointment.
Yeah, just general existential angst. I think that's right. I mean, I do think that, like, in some ways, because I come out slightly differently on the debate of like, is this data all worth anything in the end, right? But I do think that, like, regardless of whether or not it's actually effective at targeting, right, it's actually effective at making ads more, impactful. In some ways, the collection of data, the aggregation of data, almost has gotten its own logic now, right? Where it's just like, we just want more data, because if you have more data, then you're better, and then if you're better, you get paid more, right? And I do think that does create these perverse incentives in the space, which is like, even if the core of it is no longer working, we would still see a market where people are trying to like aggregate all this data, which has these very real kind of like, say, privacy consequences.
And the book, sort of the connection you make is from this space of digital advertising to the 2008 subprime lending crisis, the financial crisis. And maybe if you could talk through that a little bit, because it was, or maybe I'll give my very quick version and you can correct it. The subprime lending crisis was kind of all of these obscure, these financial instruments that were actually propping up an entire financial sector. Nobody understood it. There were some shenanigans going on, and that was like powering economies. And then it fell like a house of cards. And since digital advertising is in many ways powering the internet, and that's not an uncommon argument for the advertisers or for the publishers to make, say, look, advertising's not bad. We're funding the internet. And my understanding of your case is, well, it's the same thing. It's kind of built on a house of cards or a bubble that's due to burst. And all we've really touched on is the opacity of, does it really work? But you kind of laid out other ways that it's kind of analogous to the financial crisis.
Yeah, I think there's basically a lot of lessons to learn. It's actually kind of funny. I was joking with a friend the other week, which is like, you usually try to pick an analogy because it's like simpler than the topic that you're talking about. But like, we sort of like, the book landed on the 2008 financial crisis, which is like famously wonky and like complicated and like difficult to fully get in your head.
Read this Michael Lewis book as a prerequisite for this book.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my mom was like, this is the most boring book I could ever, so, yeah, I think that's right. So I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. But I think maybe before we dive into that, there's just a preliminary question, which is it a good metaphor, right? Is it a good parallel to what we're seeing in the ad market? And the argument that I make in the book is really like, you look at the history of financial bubbles, market bubbles of all kinds, right? 2008, but also, take your pick, right? And there's really these kind of three elements, right? Like one of them is what we've talked about, which is opacity, right? It's very difficult to know what's going on in the marketplace. And that's really important because the second element, right, which is kind of what I call sort of like subprime asset value, right? The thing that we thought was really valuable is actually decreasing in value over time. And opacity basically allows that to happen without anyone really realizing that it's going on, right? And then the final dimension that you need is sort of this kind of perverse ecosystem of people that have incentives to keep, flogging the value of it, even though that might not actually match the reality, right? And that's certainly something that you had in the subprime mortgage crisis, right? Like you had these very opaque assets, you had these mortgages that were going under, and then you had these banks and rating agencies that had very strong incentives to kind of push the market, even though, there's these kind of structural problems with it. And the argument is kind of the same exists in ads, right? Like that the market's really opaque. There's only a few people who really understand it. The quality of ads and the attention they capture is declining over time. And then you have this whole ecosystem of people who have made fortunes, right, on pushing the dream of programmatic ads. And at least what that says to me is like, yeah, okay, we have all the ingredients that kind of set us up for a market bubble. And so that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, on that group that are all sort of, I mean, it really is, it's like the ad tech vendors who are the technology supporting and the infrastructure supporting programmatic, they're incentivized. The media agencies are saying, give us this money. We have access to this magical ecosystem and we get compensated based on the more you spend, the more we get paid.
Right.
And then you've got even the advertisers, it seems, well, I guess even the advertisers are generally incentivized. I think you got into this, like it's going to be hard for them to say, or maybe this was in the Freakonomics episodes, that it's going to be hard to say, well, I bought into this for the last 5 or 8 or 10 years. That's what I've been telling the board I'm spending the money on. And by the way, the more I spend, the more my stature grows and the next bigger CMO job I can get. So it's literally no one is incentivized to, even though there's lip service to efficiency, it's everyone is incentivized to continue to let this grow, which it does seem like is analogous to the financial crisis.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, one of the things that example teaches us is that like people in the game can know the problems in the game for a really long time and have very limited incentives to solve it. Right. Like, so in the 2007 crisis, right, like banks were like, yeah, we just got to keep this going, even though we know it's not really, going to stay around for long. And I think the same is here, the case here as well in the ad markets, right? Which is like, I've heard from some people in the ad industry, they're like, yeah, we know about ad fraud, right? Like we know about like the rise of ad blockers. We know that there's opacity in the market. So like a lot of these problems are well known in the industry, right? The question is like, well, do you think that they're going to take the painful steps necessary to stop it, right? And my answer would be no.
But that's the bit that kind of left me. Like I said, I had all these mixed emotions reading this book, and the glimpse into what would the internet look like if this did fall over was something that I found myself like sitting in the garden, potting plants, thinking about, would I be prepared to pay for Google Maps because Google doesn't have a revenue stream from advertising? And I was kind of like, oh yeah, I'd be fine to pay for every time I needed to use Google Maps. And then you make this really eloquent point about like the fact that the whole internet is based on this and that there are groups of people that can't afford to pay for things like that. Mm-hmm. And then it just, do you want to paint us a little bit of a picture of what it would look like if this whole advertising world blew up?
Sure. Yeah. With pleasure. I'd be happy to do that. I mean, I think that like, again, this is like lessons we can learn from 2007, 2008, right? Like part of the trouble of what we have here is that like the bubble has grown so quickly. It generates so much money that it's very difficult, right? Like we may have all of these disagreements with, like the privacy consequences of this ecosystem and whatnot, but we're kind of chained to it in some ways, right? And I do think that like a bubble bursting, right, would have huge impacts, right? And there's kind of 3 ways that I usually think about it, right? Like, so one of them, which is on a very personal level, right, is to think about all the services you rely on every day, right, which are free, and subsidized through advertising that you might suddenly lose access to. So there's a little bit like the Google Maps question, right? And I think the huge kind of inequality that might emerge from a world in which suddenly like, well, if you can pay, you have access to these amazing services. If you can't, you don't, right? I think the second thing, which is interesting, is to think about like the whole ecosystem of media and journalism that rests on programmatic advertising, right? If you think that those things are key to, I don't know, things like democracy, right? A downturn like this could really impact, right? Like, how many people are employed, what kind of media is being produced, that entire universe of things. And then I think the final one, which is very top of mind for me, is like, as was mentioned earlier, like I worked at Google and I worked with a lot of people who are like part of their AI lab, right? And that's like cutting edge research, but it's also a huge loss leader for the company, right? That it is essentially something that's also subsidized by ads. And so I do think like a downturn would also even impact things like that we don't expect, like scientific progress, right, in the field of AI, right? Which is, I think, something that seems like very unrelated, but it has become subsidized by this ecosystem. And so, yeah, I think it touches, a lot of parts of the economy that we don't normally think about.
So, yeah, this is let's get 2021 rolling with real pick-me-ups here. But it does, going back, the one thing we didn't mention with the financial crisis was that you even had consumers, the borrowers were able to get access. People were able to buy houses because they could even get, access to credit that they didn't understand. Like, I wonder if that's kind of the advertiser analog, but
yeah. I mean, one of the things I worry about is also like the psychological price of things, right? So like the example that I always give is like, because Amazon created this super controlled ecosystem called Kindle, we don't think twice about spending $15 on what's effectively like a text document, right?
Yep.
But like for music, it has this history where there was like massive file sharing. So our psychological price of music is $0.00. And I do think that one of the impacts of a shock like this, right, is like suddenly all these consumers that were trained that certain services were $0 suddenly face like increased prices to go after those services, right? And so there's kind of questions about like what becomes sustainable in a market like that, as everybody needs to readjust to a world where, suddenly this thing that I've lived for a decade that has been free is something that I have to like pay for on a monthly basis, which I think would be like a really interesting kind of outcome of the bubble bursting.
So you kind of lay out a bit of a plan of how to kind of gently burst the bubble. Being at kind of an agency consultancy, to me, it seems like the near term for me to talk to my clients is measure this stuff, do it in our, we just had an episode about randomized controlled trials, and actually basically value your advertising a little bit better. You take kind of a much larger view of how could we have a controlled bursting that doesn't drive increased income inequality, doesn't put the already anemic journalism industry completely under in a never recoverable way. Are you able to kind of summarize how you envision that potentially working?
Yeah, sure. So the main thing that I'm really interested in, right, is like, in some ways, I think it's like the macro version of, Tim, what you're talking about on the agency level, right? Like, because on the agency level, you're basically saying to clients, look, maybe you should measure this better, right? You're going to learn some things that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but hey, we should probably be having those conversations sooner rather than later. And in some ways, my proposal is like to do that, but at a market-wide scale, right? Because right now, basically, people don't face any real consequences for like distributing garbage information essentially into the marketplace. And so the dream is, again, this is like a super wonky thing, but like the idea is like the government you can imagine a world where the government says, look, there's certain data standards for the kinds of ad inventory you're going to put out into this market. And if it turns out that those metrics are false, right, you will actually face liability for them. And what's interesting is that the idea here is not to put the government in a world where it says this ad is good and this ad is bad, right? Which is, I think, is very difficult to do, but more in a world where it's trying to at least increase the credibility of the kinds of information that you get through these markets, right? And I do think that that is a powerful way forwards, just because I think part of the reason we have a bubble is because the information is so cloudy. And also because of, obviously, the duopoly has been very reticent about giving up information. Mm-hmm. So all these things, I think, like combine to make a market that's like deeply unhealthy. And so I think one thing that can be done certainly is like regulation that helps shine a light on what's going on.
But I feel like this is that space where regulation is always so behind. I mean, even if you look at data privacy, I mean, yes, Europe was very forward leaning, but I feel like generally regulation is so behind because they don't understand the problem. Like,
Sure.
If that's the option, like I don't know, I still feel really bleak.
Yeah, I think I think that's a totally fair point. I mean, maybe you could try. I mean, I'm curious about Mo, what you think about this. Is like one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is whether or not privacy laws end up being like the detonator for the bubble. And the reason being is basically like all of these advertisers are like, don't take my data away. If you take my data away, ads will just not work anymore. And I almost imagine a world where there's almost this perverse outcome where like GDPR really comes into force, CCPA really comes into force. And it actually turns out that like ads are okay. Like that it turns out that all this data we've collected, is pretty much the same as like really dumb contextual advertising from decades ago. And I think that sort of thing would really kind of shine a light on like maybe the fact that, all this data actually is not what we thought it was. And that really could readjust the market in some ways. But what's interesting is the regulators wouldn't be intentionally doing that. They'd sort of be like kind of just like elephant in a glass shop, sort of like causing this to occur.
Well, and it stood out to me that you didn't delve into privacy regulations as a mechanism in the book necessarily for like doing that. So I'm really glad to hear you bring it up, because that sort of stood out to me as sort of like, well, that might have a part to play. Because again, like who's owning that data? That's really what GDPR and CCPA are really getting at, which is, okay, well, Google has all this data on you and Facebook has all this data on you. And it's sort of like, well, to what extent are they allowed to? And oh, by the way, is even as like Apple does what they're doing with sort of browser level privacy to combat that, they're already like Facebook is already working behind the scenes to basically create a server to server API call where they're actively encouraging brands who advertise with them to pass email addresses and phone numbers as part of the data that they send through. And it's like, whoa, like you want what? And then in addition to that, you now have potentially evidence. In December, there was the lawsuit that was filed by the state of Texas against Google, where there seems to be even potential collusion between Facebook and Google, if this is actually true, I guess alleged collusion on price fixing with what's called header bidding, which is basically, not to get into too many weeds, but, you kind of allude to this, which is publishers will basically say like, who can give me the best price for this advertising inventory that I can sell? And in the header of the page as it loads, there's an auction going on, and Google and Facebook basically agreed to basically split the difference and not drive the price up on each other.
Right. Yeah. I think it's really interesting seeing regulators wrangle with some of these problems, because the ad ecosystem is very wonky, right? And I think it's exactly the kind of thing that Mo's talking about, right? Which is like, it's a case where regulators are trying to like get up with everything that's been happening in this ecosystem. And I think they're doing pretty good so far, right? I think like the complaints that were launched are pretty informed, right? And certainly the collusion case, if proven, is like, it's a really big deal. Yeah. I think it's also really interesting seeing, I mentioned this before the kind of recording started, but the FTC basically put out a informational request to a bunch of social media companies. And I thought what was one of the most interesting things, right, is that the FTC is ostensibly a privacy regulator. It's really interested in what data these companies have on consumers. But hidden in that questionnaire was actually a long set of questions about all the inaccurate information they have. And so I do think that like this relationship is sort of between privacy and like the effectiveness of ads, are tied in these pretty complex ways. And I think it's going to lead to some really interesting conversations, because traditionally it's been, they have all the data and that's why we should be worried. I guess in some ways my book argues like they have all the data, but maybe we should be worried, not necessarily because it like gives them, unique persuasive power, but because of all the other problems that it creates in the marketplace.
Which is, that's, you take the social dilemma and how so many of the social media companies kind of stumbled in or followed the lead of Facebook, that had no idea they were going to become, all of their revenue basically being advertising. And so clearly no plan on the route they went. But then you have so many of these kind of shadow industries. I try to explain to people like, every time you click through on the like 120 celebrity couples who've been together forever, you'd never believe. And just that user experience that is so painful, but is because it is that ecosystem. It is all those transactions, just impressions being bought by intermediaries to resell impressions. I'm like, that to me seems like the clearest evidence that this is clearly broken. You have junk content that is actually paying for advertising so that it can get people where it can have more impressions that it can resell. And there's so much money sloshing around in that area that when it does come to regulation, policy changes, it does feel like a pretty tough row to hoe when there are going to be a lot of dollars pushing back saying, yeah, this is really a problem, but go fix another part of the problem. Don't come after the DSP technology is totally fine. Go chase the bots, or that just feels like the struggle is that it's going to be kind of whack-a-mole with point solutions that will have people seeing dollar signs to work around whatever point solutions get regulated or put forth.
Yeah, and I think ultimately this may end up becoming a conversation around sort of activist strategy, almost, is like a way to think about it, right? Which is like, what are the kinds of evidence which will cause the biggest advertisers to back out of this ecosystem? And I think that's ultimately going to be the thing that will really reshape the market, just because I agree, right? Like, we have very blunt instruments when it comes to regulation. We have very blunt instruments when it comes to public opinion. But the minute, Procter & Gamble is pulling millions of dollars out of the ecosystem, I think it does start to create incentives that are moving in a better direction. I don't think it's a silver bullet by any measure.
Well, but you mentioned the P&G, and that was kind of a we're pulling our dollars out, and everybody's like, this is big and it's bold and it's right. And a couple other large companies have done it, but it seems, why has that not really gotten traction? Is it because there's so many forces saying we don't want to look too closely and find out that's right? We can just say, oh, that's P&G. They're massive. We're only $100 million company, so this doesn't apply. Because that was like 2 or 3 years ago.
True.
That P&G started saying that, right?
Yeah, and I think that's right. Yeah, exactly. And it may just be, that's one of the most interesting things about financial bubbles, right? If you study sort of the history of them, is that like the kind of thing that sort of triggers the stampede out of a market is not always like the biggest advertiser moving out, right? And yeah, I don't know, Tim, I think it like suggests to me at least that that the incentives are kind of pretty strong here to kind of keep the ball rolling, because at the point at which you have these really big advertisers moving out and it doesn't kind of create that cascade, I guess we are left wondering kind of like what does, right?
So I have a very odd question, and I'm hoping no one has asked you this in any other forum, but it's something I couldn't help thinking about as I was reading your book, where you really lay the foundation when you start talking about, like, when Google started, they thought, the percentage of revenue coming from advertising, I think you said it was 17%, but don't quote me.
17%, exactly.
And, now obviously it's like their main revenue stream, and no one anticipated that. You've obviously spent so much time and energy, and I think you write about this problem so incredibly well. Have you seen, though, those early indicators that we're somehow setting ourselves up for failure in another new space that perhaps we're only just starting to see those signs of? And I think, I don't know if that's something that you've given thought to, but I couldn't help trying to think of, like, oh, I wonder if there are other situations where if we look closely enough, we could see that they might become problematic, like advertising has?
Sure. I mean, I think that, I think the answer to that question is, in some ways, advertising has become the like business model hammer for every nail, is the way I'd put it, right? Like, that essentially, like, programmatic advertising has been like just this pure capitalist rocket fuel. That's just like, if you can turn businesses into a programmatic advertising business, you're doing great, right? And I do think that's the case, right? As you see, people, being like, okay, search is over, display is dominated. There's just this increased press to basically say, can we get programmatic advertising into other channels, right? Expand it into as many corners as possible. And I guess part of my worry is that it kind of like it sort of spreads the infection, if you will, right? That it actually creates these pathologies in entirely new media channels that may have not had these problems before. I mean, one example, which I don't think is large in terms of market size, but is near and dear to my heart, is like the world of podcasting, right? Which is that like podcasts have run on a very old school ad model. Is there a push right now to make them programmatic? Like for sure. And the part of the problem is that the idea is like, okay, but do you also want all of the kind of like market warping incentives that are created by introducing that as sort of your life stream for your economy? And so I do think that those are kind of like the new frontiers I'm looking at, but it's largely kind of like extensions of the empire of programmatic advertising.
I mean, I guess for us, the question is about how much money do you think we could make if we kind of sold our souls?
Right. Squarespace, build it beautiful. Yeah, right.
Yeah. ZipRecruiter.
Yeah, right.
This is brought to you by Snack in a Box, subscription service of the month, whatever it is.
It's not in the book, but it's a thesis I've been playing around with a little bit, which is like, is there kind of like an optimal amount of data you want in a marketplace before it becomes terrible? Right. Which is like, okay, imagine a world where like basically like you have no information about your readers. Well, you're kind of just flying by the seat of your pants. Maybe you produce lots of stuff they don't actually like. Right. And then you have a little bit more data and you're like, okay, well, yeah, I can calibrate stuff that like they'll like. And like, that's actually like a good place to be. And maybe we're kind of there for podcasts right now. But then eventually you like have like the dashboard up on your Office and you're like, does this get as many click views or view count as this other post? And like that introduces all sorts of terrible incentives to be like, yeah, what maximizes that metric? And so there's kind of an interesting progression, right? Which is like, there's a point at which the data becomes so granular that it actually produces all of these like negative effects on kind of like the quality of the work. And so I don't know, it's just kind of like a vague armchair theory at the moment.
I like it. Wow. I wish my vague armchair theories I wish my fully thought out, well-formed theories were like 20% of that.
But you can actually see large corporate interests jockeying into position for the future you're describing, Tim, on podcasting, like Spotify with all the moves they've made in buying a number of companies. And then they made that massive investment to, I don't know if it's acquire, but basically like acquire the Joe Rogan podcast, which is like, I guess, a really popular podcast. And so like it's coming, right? Because everybody is sort of like, we presume the algorithm we'll put our weight on the stone, and once it starts rolling, we'll reap the benefits.
Yeah.
I ran across an article, I think it might have been on Bloomberg or somewhere, but I can't remember. But it basically was something around BlackRock as a private equity company was exploring, as they acquire companies in private equity, packaging and selling their data as another asset to basically recoup the investment they're making in the company. And I was just like, okay, so that's another horizon we haven't really, gotten into, as a society, is sort of like, yeah, we're just going to have corporate raiders now coming in and being like, here's some data. Who wants it? Who wants it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a disturbing thing. I think this was a story that happened when Radio Shack went out of business in the US. Right, which is basically that it turned out that like one of the big assets they sold in the bankruptcy was their enormous data set on American consumers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just talking to a friend the other day about like, there's also a very vibrant data ecosystem between the ad economy, sort of political advertisers and churches in providing data. I do think that like the ad ecosystem creates all these interesting links between, sort of organizations that otherwise wouldn't have like reasons to talk, just because it suddenly becomes profitable to mine, certain types of data that otherwise, in the past wouldn't be considered an asset at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely sort of a time in which advertising is like one piece of this, but it's spreading everywhere, which is probably why we need a law about it. But I will say this, like I've often maintained, and I think your book was kind of useful to me in this, which was, I've often said of like the analytics space, like a lot of shenanigans happen because of the lack of relative maturity of the space. Like we haven't been around, digital hasn't been around for all that long. And so it's sort of like, yeah, we're all still kind of learning. But the juxtaposition of the mortgage crisis to this, I was like, well, the mortgage space wasn't immature. Like it's been going on for a long, long time. And yet they still managed to work themselves into a pretty intractable situation. And so it's really given me some pause on sort of like the way that I've been mentally framing it up. And so for that reason, I found it really useful and helpful to read your book.
Cool. Yeah, really appreciate it. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, again, I think like there's an interesting question about like what programmatic advertising should be considered like as a subset of, right? Because if you consider it as like the latest generation of advertising, then it is almost is kind of like similar to the mortgage situation, right? Where mortgages existed for a really long time. And then we were like, hey, actually, we could collateralize this debt and buy it and sell it as an asset. And in some ways, I think that's like what's happened with advertising, right? Which is like, we've bought and sold attention for many, many years, right? Decades. But like only now have we been like, oh, you know what we could do with attention? We could slice it up and sell it at, rapid speed in this particular way. And I think that's like producing all these effects. Like it hasn't been just like evolution, right? It's actually been like kind of like a revolution and sort of like the impact of the technology.
I can't help but wonder, this is what I just keep going down all these crazy paths, which just, I don't know why. What made marketers accept, I guess, the black box of programmatic advertising in the first place? And it does seem like the shift in the industry and the way things are going with privacy, we're moving back to that state again. Like, I kind of have laid here being like, why would they just accept that? And why wouldn't they challenge it? And how can we get them to challenge it more? Mm-hmm. It's like the thought that's running through my head.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think in some ways, like this is an interesting critique that I've been like thinking about how to wrestle with, right? Which is the book came out and some ad people said, well, look, people spend a lot of money on it, right? They wouldn't spend money on it if it didn't work, right? Like, so how do you explain that? Like, how do you explain that? And again, I know there's a little bit of a fallacy there, right? But I do think that like, we have to address the question of like, why do people adopt this stuff if it is so faulty, right? And I do think that like one of them is, I think like the myths that we tell about data, right? Which is that like, it's very hard if you're sitting in a room and being like, we're either going to buy this old school media channel called a newspaper and it doesn't have like a lot of data, or we can buy this big fancy one that everybody's talking about that has all the data, right? And like almost regardless of whether or not the data is faulty or not, the fact that they have the data is like pretty powerful. And so I do think that like that is like one thing for sure. There's a thesis again that I really want to write about that didn't make its way into the book, which is sort of a funny, again, like kind of like totally speculative theory that I'd love to research some more, which is that in the early days of banner advertising, the click-through rate was 44%, right? And now it's more like 0.01%, right? So you basically had in 30 years a 100-fold decrease in the effectiveness of this ad channel. One theory about it, though, is like maybe the reason we pay attention to ads is just that they're novel, they're new. That's why we look at them. So like you imagine like the first billboard that ever was put up where people like driving by and they're like, wow, that guy on that billboard told me to smoke cigarettes, so I should go buy some cigarettes, And then like over time, we just got used to it as a society and the effectiveness declined. And so there's always one theory, which is that early on, online advertising looked really, really effective, but it had nothing to do with the data. It had everything to do with the fact that it was new. And so we just happened to pay more attention to it. And so now historically, we're now like banners and search are now kind of becoming the next billboards, right? And if you buy that, there's almost like no way to recover, but it certainly explains why early on advertisers would be willing to go to this new channel because in the early days, it is actually in fact that much better, right? But again, it has nothing to do with data or technology.
But it was a dual. It was not only it was novelty, so therefore had more attention, but the people who were doing it were the ones that were like direct response digital advertising. Because I had commented on, I'd tweeted or posted somewhere about your book, and somebody did chime in and they're like, well, every time we run advertising, we get results. And I'm like, yeah, if you're a retailer and you're selling shoes and you're buying paid search for those shoes, sure. Like, and you can kind of quantify from a last click. But to me, part of what happened is that, well, that became part of the mythology is that everybody can do it. Oh, you're selling pet food. You're selling boring old pet food. You got to be in digital too. So to me, it's this marketers are somewhat kind of lemmings. They had been beaten up for years about not being able to quantify the impact of their investments. Somebody came along, the Pied Piper of ad tech came along with a story, and they're like, we will happily follow that out. And now we've got numbers that we can point to. And when you combine that, I mean, I loved how you made the point that it's kind of a steadily decreasing effectiveness, but nobody's really watching that sort of trend of effectiveness. They're saying, well, we didn't get quite the click-through rate that we got last year, but you know what? X or Y, it's noise in the data. And, they don't necessarily look, and they don't have a constant way of measuring. The things are changing so much, new channels to advertise on, they can't even see a truly long-term trend and recognize that they're spending more to chase less, and they're trying to do it for everything, not just kind of a direct response, direct sell where it would actually work.
Yeah. And I think this is connected to the opacity point. Like, one of the ironies is that we have a lot more data about like a given ad, but we have a lot, like, it's basically, no man's land in terms of trying to figure out how the market as a whole is evolving. Right. And so we're kind of like, we have like really, really deep transparency, but in some ways it's extremely narrow. And I think that is a big problem to trying to get to the bottom of like what's actually going on.
So much more data, but we know less.
Yeah. Ironically, right. Is sort of the of this.
And as marketers, we'll end up chasing channels, right? So this week it's TikTok, and next week it's whatever is going to be up next.
Yeah, and I think we do also, I mean, this is very natural, but I do think we suffer from a bias of like, we hear about the success stories, right? But we don't have a really good measure of like all of the failures.
Yep, 100%.
And so everybody can point to an anecdote where ads worked, right? And I agree. There are situations where ads work, right? The question is like, is that the norm or is that the outlier?
Right.
Yep. Yeah, this is such a great topic, and we do have to start to wrap up. But I mean, I think all three of us, Tim, really got a lot reading the book, and the book is The Subprime Attention Crisis. And I think you're getting the official podcast recommend here from the team. So
Thank you.
Really nice job. Thank you so much for writing it. Thanks for coming on the show.
I want to throw in that just the book is like, it's like 140 pages of content.
Yeah.
It's got a bunch of, it is both super well researched. It is not a lengthy read. Like, it sounds like, oh my God, is this going to be some super dense? And like, I'm still kind of blown away with how you managed to pack the pieces together and have, I don't know how you seem like one of the people who maybe just doesn't ever sleep, but for like, I really do think people should, like, this is not a book that takes a long time to read, and it is so informative. So
it's really informative.
Thank you.
You mentioned Flash Boys early in the book by Michael Lewis, and as I was reading it, I was like, yeah, we need a character through this thing. So I was like, you should maybe version 2 is like the Michael Lewis treatment. Of
The Hollywood adaptation of this book.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll
Yeah,
get Brad Pitt to pay like the main character.
Yeah, that's right. I think Seth Rogen will be ready for a serious role, and like, anyways, okay, we do have to start to wrap up. One thing we love to do on the show is called a last call. We just go around the horn. We share something of interest that we think might be interesting to our listeners. Tim Hwang, you're our guest. Do you have a last call you'd like to share?
Sure. I'll plug a weird side project that I've been working on for the last year or so. I don't know how many of the listeners are based in the US, but I run a small project called the Trade Journal Cooperative. One of the things I'm really a big fan of is obscure trade journals. And this is a quarterly subscription service that sends you an obscure trade journal once a quarter. So previous issues have included Elevator World, which is the magazine of the elevator and escalator industry. They actually call themselves the vertical transportation industry, which is really great. And last year we basically, and last year we've covered magicians. The most recent one was like private investigators. So if reading those magazines gets you interested, I'll just plug that project.
It's kind of like you're the Gary Vaynerchuk of trade journals. So instead of getting your wine subscription, you're getting obscure trade journals.
Yeah, it's something like that. So
do you make a video each time one goes out where you talk through the fascinating?
Yeah, I really should though. I really should.
Yes.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's definitely going to take a look at that. So Mo, what about you? You have a last call you want to share?
I have a request and then I have an odd last call. So the request is, one of the things that I did reading this book is I tried to remember the last 5 ads I saw, and I didn't have a freaking clue. And then even as I became aware of trying to so first I just did it of like, what do I think the last 5 ads were? I had no idea. And then even when I tried to flip my awareness to like try and recall the next 5 ads you see, I still really struggled. So I just feel like it's a really interesting exercise, particularly for data analysts, to try and have a play around with and be like, oh, here's this thing that we spend all of our lives trying to measure, and yet we can't recall them ourselves. The other thing, so I came across something really bizarre, but I really enjoyed reading about it. So I don't even remember how I stumbled on it, but it's called auction theory. And there's two Stanford economists, Robert Wilson and Paul Milgram. I think they actually have won the Nobel Prize now for their work. Yep. There was a BBC podcast, more or less behind the stats auction theory, that I somehow ended up listening to randomly. And I just found it really fascinating. And the reason I found it so fascinating is because in Australia, all properties pretty much go to auction. You don't normally like make someone an offer. It's like they auction everything to try and get the highest prices. And I just found that this podcast was really fascinating, how it talked about the whole idea of like you have a mass auction and how everyone actually ends up better off. Anyway, if it's auction's something you're interested in.
Wasn't part of theirs part of the winner's curse? I don't know if they were the winner's curse, but isn't that part of auction theory is like when governments that have adopted auctions for like bidding for contracts that they're like, we award it to the second lowest price, not the lowest, because if you go to the extreme, the person who actually wins gets screwed.
They talk about the example of the like telecommunications bandwidth and how you auction that off and everyone actually ends up getting what they need. But I don't remember the winner's curse, so maybe I'll have to do more reading. But anyway,
I don't think the winner's curse was auction. Well, it is part of auction. I don't know.
Anyway, I need to clearly do more reading, but it's a fascinating topic.
Tim, the quintessential analyst, Tim, is who we're talking to.
Well, so I almost thought we were going to wind up hitting my last call while we were talking. So one, I completely missed that Morning Consult did a whole like special report last year on podcasts. And it is like a series of different, and a lot of it went into different, Morning Consult. They're always kind of collecting data and doing surveys. So it has a whole bunch of different articles where they kind of dug into some of it being the payment model for podcasts, some of it being advertising for podcasts. So it's just a very interesting, I haven't worked through all of the articles in it, but it's a very well curated set of articles about different aspects of podcasting. But I did read one talking about the effectiveness of ads, and it was talking about how much higher. The example used was from Crooked Media, which 3 podcasts that I listen to every week are out of Crooked Media, and those are hosts that actually kind of have a whole banter, unscripted advertising, so like the multi-touch moment that we used to have. And it leads off with the examples of John Lovett and John Favreau and Tommy Vitor on that. So my second part of my last call is to actually recommend Just Egg, which was one of the mung bean based egg substitute that they plugged. And I did actually go out and buy some, and I was delighted. We eat a lot of eggs. And I was like, okay, they're just bantering about this. Like these really are a good egg substitute, and they really work. So I thought I'd do I'd help out with Pod Save America's podcast advertising impact. I don't have a website with a special code to go to, so their measurement may be screwed. But
I was going to say, good luck on the attribution with that one.
Yeah. So what's yours, Michael?
Well, okay, so Mo, to kind of like chime in on your observation, literally the day before we recorded this, so we kind of record shows in advance, Twitter went crazy with this speculation about a specific advertisement that was a bit cheeky, let's say, that a lot of people ran across, and like Vice even did an article on it like today, which is basically like digging into like, why is everyone seeing this ad right now, and where is it coming from? And so it's just sort of like, how timely. So anyways, so there you go. Okay. So as I was researching for the show, I got interested in who published this book. And so I was looking at the publisher, and I ran across, it was sort of a joint publishing effort between, I guess, sort of an imprint of Macmillan and a group called Logic. And then I was like Googling that to figure out what the heck that was. Turns out it's a little magazine called Logic Mag, where they've kind of taken a stand of sort of like, we're going to write about technology, but we're going to write about it really thoughtfully and really slowly and on paper. And so I subscribed, and I'm really looking forward to getting some of their stuff, and it looks pretty neat. So just, following threads. So Logic Magazine, kind of nifty I'm looking forward to it. They only publish like 3 times a year. So, okay. I'm sure you've been listening and you've been thinking, wow, this is a crazy topic. How do I find out more? Well, here's a cool thing. You can actually follow Tim Hwang on Twitter. He's at Tim, Hwang, Tim Hwang on Twitter. So you can follow him there. And you can also reach out to us on the Measure Slack or on our LinkedIn group. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the show's topic. As always, our show would not be possible without our inimitable producer, Josh Crowhurst, doing what he does behind the scenes to make these shows a reality. So thank you very much, Josh. And lastly, Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to write the book, come on the show today. It's been a really pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was great. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Awesome. And I know that no matter where you are in this opaque ecosystem that sometimes gets our goat, you know that both of my co-hosts and I all agree you should keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening. And don't forget to join the conversation on Twitter or in the Measure Slack. We welcome your comments and questions. Visit us on the web at analyticshour.io or on Twitter at analyticshour.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Analytics. Oh my God. What the fuck does that even mean?
I feel like this year I haven't seen anyone. It's been very strange.
Yeah.
Why's that?
Don't even get me started. It's been the week from hell.
It's Monday, Mo.
You have heard Christmas is cancelled in Sydney.
What do you mean Christmas is canceled?
I didn't think that was a legislated.
Yeah, we've got Dr. Fauci here in the United States telling kids that Santa's been vaccinated. It's totally cool. I'm like, thanks, Dr. Fauci.
And Tim, author Tim, if I suddenly sound really exacerbated and I'm like, God, Tim, it's definitely the other Tim I'm talking about.
Okay, I mean, it's fine if it's to me, too. That's all right.
Yeah. Tim Wilson is going to ask you. You will get asked a 4-part question at some point today.
Great.
And
bring it on.
So I'm sure you can handle it.
Well, bring it on if you can distinguish parts 1 from 2, 3, and 4. Because sometimes they mold together.
Tim Wilson, you're hilarious. And that's actually
and I think that's
really
the thing that's getting really
for me. Oh, okay.
I'd like to call out that this was actually, I was not the one talking over either one of you. You talked over each other.
I started talking first, so I don't know how that happened.
Rock flag and collateralized digital advertising.
The mouthful.
Sorry. We do a It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia little takeoff at the end that goes in the outtakes, and I botched that one.
That's okay, because that'll go in the outtakes too.